when was the last time you had to think about your wheel size? If you're a road rider, chances are you've never had to think about it, and quite rightly so. With just a few exceptions, road wheels have been set to a 700C measurement for a long time. But there is an area where this is slightly different, and that's the world of gravel. Over there on the off-road stuff, there's another wheel size, 650B, that's often bandied about. This smaller wheel size offers its own set of properties and performance benefits. Pairing a smaller rim with a wider tyre can bring with it a completely different feel to your bike, and especially if you want to go properly off-road. Now, we're not saying you can fit a set of 650B wheels to just any old bike. Chances are it might have a detrimental effect to the handling, and of course if you've got rim brakes it definitely won't work. But if your new bike says it's able to do 700 or 650B, or you've got a fairly new gravel or adventure bike, well, you might just be curious as to see what changing the wheel size does to that bike. So let's look first at the 700C wheel, so the one that we're most familiar with. Now, they don't actually measure 700 millimeters. The technical measurement for the diameter of the wheel is 622 millimeters. Now, that's pretty specific, and just to make matters a little bit more confusing, that doesn't actually measure the diameter of the wheel itself. It's actually the diameter to the rim bed, so where the rim and where your tyre or your tube sits inside the wheel. So it doesn't go to the end here. Now, 700C obviously has some performance benefits, otherwise why would we be using them? And first and foremost, the one that everyone always talks about is rolling resistance, or the lack of rolling resistance. So technically a larger wheel should roll smoother and faster for a set distance. Because it's a larger diameter, it will carry more momentum as well, so it should keep you going and should maintain speed better than a smaller wheel. And the final thing, the one thing that obviously is most important if we're considering going off-road, is the way that a larger rim can cope with bumps. So what we're talking about here is the way it can roll over things. So we look at mountain bikers, and for a while now people know that a 29er wheel, which is the biggest wheel you can get on a mountain bike, tends to roll better over obstacles than the smaller 27.5 or 26, the classic 26-inch. So the same goes for these wheels as well. Now, if we look at 650B, the newcomer here, and yes, as the name suggests, it measures 650 millimeters from the outside to the outside, including the tyre. So it measures actually 584 millimeters, just to confuse things, and that's the same to the rim bed itself. There's a few advantages for a smaller wheel size. First and foremost, obviously because it's smaller, it accelerates quicker, so it gets up to speed quicker than a larger wheel. So it technically should be faster from a standing start. You'll also notice that the majority of the 650B wheels will come with wider, bigger volume tyres, and that's probably the biggest advantage that most people talk about here. So you can run a bigger tyre on a smaller wheel and still have good clearances in your frame and forks. Also, because you can run a wider, higher volume tyre, it's got better bump absorption and grip as well. So you can run lower pressures, so for off-road riding it should provide more grip. Now, the way that most brands will get away with enabling a bike to run both 700C and 650B is down to the type of tyre you use. So they plan on making sure that you're running tyres that will give both wheels roughly a similar outside diameter. So technically, a 700C wheel running around about a 28 to a 32 mil tyre is going to give a very, very similar outside diameter to a 650B wheel running a higher volume, something like a 45 or a 47C tyre. So that means then that a lot of the features of the bike should stay the same, but you will then either have the advantages of a 700 or the advantages of a 650B. So apart from the main advantages of each of the different wheel sizes, what you'll find is if you swap your wheels around, it can have an impact on the geometry of your bike. And by geometry, we're talking about the angles and dimensions of your bike. And these are the things that dictate how well it rides. So if you change the wheels, obviously there can be a difference in terms of the geometry. And there's several different ways it can affect that. It can change the bottom bracket height. So by putting a smaller set of wheels, obviously that can lower the bottom bracket. Changing wheels can also have a small impact on the wheelbase of your bike. So that is the length of your bike. Now, obviously putting a smaller set of wheels could potentially make a difference there, but this is mainly down to the tyres and the tyre pressure that you put in there. But obviously a shorter wheelbase makes it a little bit more nimble, and a long wheelbase makes it more stable. Probably one of the most important things that can happen is it can change the trail of your fork. So by this, it means it can adjust where your steering comes from. So this is a bit more of a physics-based thing. So a smaller set of wheels can give a smaller trail on your fork, and that means then that the handling gets a little bit faster and the bike feels a bit more nimble. But the downside of that is it can be a little bit more unstable. So putting bigger wheels in obviously makes the handling a little bit slower, but inherently makes the bike more stable. Okay, so that's enough theory there. So we're going to go through a few different practical tests next. Now, what I've done as well to make this as scientific as possible. Now, obviously this isn't scientific per se, but I've chosen two sets of wheels that should give us fairly similar uniform results. So I've got two sets of carbon gravel wheels by a company called Steyr. So these are super nice. And the first thing I did was I measured them and I weighed them. And the interesting thing is I would have expected the 650B wheels to be quite a bit lighter because they're smaller, but there actually was only around about 40 grams difference. So that was the first thing to notice. Now, I've then chose two sets of tyres that are the same tread pattern. So these are Donnelly's tyres. They are the USH tyres, and I've got a 40mm tyre on the 700C wheels and a 42mm tyre on the 650Bs. Now, we talked about one of the advantages of a smaller wheel is that tyre pressure and the grip. So you can technically run these at lower pressures because you've got a bigger volume. But for the sake of uniformity here, I've put 40 PSI in both sets. These are set up tubeless as well, so you can run lower pressures with no problems at all. The first test we did was a rolling resistance test. For this, it's really simple. So it's not perfect science, but we found a nice off-road hill that we could use as our test bed. And it was as simple as going to the top of the hill, clipping in, and then freewheeling down to a certain point. Now, rather than finishing at the bottom of the hill, we carried on going onto the flat so we could then see how the wheels kept momentum. So when I started this test, I was expecting the 700C wheels to roll away with it, excuse the pun. But what was very interesting was as soon as I got on the bike, I noticed that the 650B wheels get to speed really quickly. So when we tested this against the clock, the results were actually very interesting. If you're pedaling around, what you'll find is the 700C wheels do feel much faster. But for this freewheeling test, the results were in favour of the 650B. So they were nearly a second faster over the distance than the 700C wheels, which completely blew me away really. And it is down to the fact that they get to speed much quicker. And because we didn't go over a long distance, they maintained that speed. So the actual results were it took 21.68 seconds to do the test on the 650B wheels, and the 700C wheels did it in 22.55. So it was very noticeable in terms of the difference. The second test, we wanted to do a climbing test. Now this would be testing quite a few different things. First and foremost, obviously grip. Now, a larger volume tyre, as we find on the 650B wheel, should give you a larger contact patch. So it's normally shorter and fatter than you'd find on a 700C wheel, which means that it should give better grip. Now, to keep this being more about the wheels themselves than my own riding style, what I intended doing is I rode the hill, stood up and in the center of the bike. So rather than moving back and forth and sitting down to give it grip, I was totally reliant on the wheels and the tread themselves to do it. The climb I chose was a little bit of a combination of a few rooty bits, some steep bits, and a few little loamy sections. So it wasn't the grippiest. And as you can see on the video, both sets of wheels got to the point where they spun out. Now, that could have happened because of me, but in this case, the one thing that was noticeable is it took me further up the hill on the 650B than it did on the 700C. So there was a bit more grip on that. Now, that was as I was expecting. Now, the other thing as well we can think about with this is obviously tyre pressure and tread pattern is really important when it comes to your climbing grip. So you might have found that a slightly different tread pattern on a 700C would actually give you better grip. So it really does come down to your own personal preference on this. For the third test, we looked at the way that the wheels can roll over obstacles. Now, both sets of wheels have a different angle that they will hit an obstacle at, and the larger wheel will have more of a rollover effect, so it's better at dealing with bumps. And this was apparent straight away. Now you can see on the slow motion video that when both sets of wheels hit the obstacles, the first thing that happened obviously is tire deflection, but the 650B wheel tends to get hung up a little bit more on the roots. 700C, because it's got more of an angle of attack and it has more of the wheel already over an obstacle of a certain size, it means it maintains that momentum way better. So for climbing and for riding over things like roots and other rocky obstacles, the 700C wheel definitely felt much, much smoother. Which one is better? Well, in all honesty, they're very, very different, and it's very hard to say that one is better than the other. Now, I also have several different personal observations in terms of riding these two wheel sizes. I've ridden a lot of gravel bikes with 700C wheels and 650B wheels, but this is the first time I've really taken the same bike and ridden the wheels back to back. So it gave me a real idea as to just what it does. And it's really noticeable in terms of the differences, but it's also noticeable in terms of how quickly you get used to those differences. Now, if I was looking at choosing a bike that was going to be as fast as possible on light off-road terrain and using it on the road as well, then no question of a doubt I would be sticking to 700C wheels. They feel faster, and especially when you're pedaling, they certainly are faster. It's basic physics here in terms of the fact that it has a larger circumference, so for every pedal revolution it will go further. So from an efficiency point of view, there is a little bit more within that 700C in my own personal opinion. Now, that's not saying that I would then choose that wheel over everything else, because the 650B wheel made that bike feel incredible off-road. It was so much more nimble, so much more light, and actually really enjoyable. So it felt to me a bit more like a mountain bike, and in terms of that, it meant it felt much more engaging as a ride itself. So if I was doing a lot more of riding of that style, so keeping off-road as much as possible, I certainly would be choosing to go for 650B wheels with their higher volume tyres, because it just makes a big difference. It's also more comfortable and you've got better traction as well. In general, if you were choosing that larger volume tyre, it's still going to be really, really fast on the road itself. As you saw in the rolling resistance test, it maintains that speed very, very well. So that is one thing to consider. Now, the other thing I did notice as well, which does have an impact, is the way that the different wheel sizes can have an impact on your gearing as well. So again, this comes down to that difference in terms of circumference. So you find when you're on a 650B wheel, it actually feels like you're slightly lower geared than you are on a 700C wheel. So it's something to consider in terms of what type of riding you're going to do. So again, doing lots of super steep or proper off-road riding, that 650B is going to feel a lot better on that steep terrain. Well, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and more importantly, click on that notification bell to keep up with our latest releases. And if you've got any comments about 700C versus 650B, please put it in the comments section below. Until then, we'll see you soon.